Good evening, everybody. Welcome. So good to see so many people here this evening. It looks like a lot of old friends and a lot of new faces here for this evening's program. So I'm glad to see you all. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs for the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And again, we're glad to see so many of you here tonight for a very exciting program. This is the first in a new series of collaborative programs between Harper's Magazine and the Mark Twain House and Museum, and we'll be talking more about that in just a few moments. I'm not going to stay on screen for too long, but I just wanted to alert you to a few features of Crowdcast that you might not be familiar with if you are new to this platform. I see many of you have discovered the chat already, so keep chatting away. We love to see that, and it's a really fun part of the Crowdcast that makes it feel in some ways like we are actually all together. And you should know that this program is being recorded and will live on our website after the program is over, and the chat remains live. So if you would like to make a pen pal here, you can come back and chat right here at the program. However, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end of our talk tonight, and if you do have a question for Lauren or for Christopher, please take a moment to put that at the bottom of the screen where you see the Ask a Question section. That makes it a lot easier for us to manage the Q&A at the end. So if you would do us that favor, that would be awesome. We also would very much appreciate your paying a little bit of attention to that long greenish box right under my face right now. The Mark Twain House and Museum is a nonprofit organization. Our main source of income is our guided house tour or admissions from that. And we've been unable to offer it for most of the past year. Now we're really excited that in a couple of weeks we are going to start opening for tours once again, but it's been a long time and we've been without our major source of revenue for most of the past year. And what's kept us afloat is the generosity of our friends and audience members such as yourselves. So anything you might be able to share with us in the way of a donation, large or small, just want you to know that on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum, every single penny is appreciated and every single penny is put to very good use. So thank you in advance if you're able to support us in that way. I want to also point out that you may purchase a copy of Fake Accounts, Lauren Oyler's wonderful new book, through our museum store, and there's a link to that in the chat. Now, I know, we all know, that you have other options for purchasing this book, but I want to point out that number one, if you purchase through us, you get a signed copy, which is not standard in other venues, and also if you do purchase through us, it's benefiting the Mark Twain House and Museum, so please consider doing that if you're able. And we would very much appreciate it. So we have a whole lot of programs coming up. In fact, we were talking at a staff meeting today that between now and the first 2 weeks of May, we have a public program every single Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night. So there's a lot to come back to, including several more of these Harper's and Mark Twain House programs. So rather than list them all here, I would encourage you to not only visit, but bookmark marktwainhouse.org and check out our virtual programs there. And we hope to see you often. Before we introduce our speakers tonight, I would like to introduce to you our Executive Director, Peter Roos, who has a few words to say. So, Peter, let me bring you up. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Well, how are you? Good to see you.
Good. I just want to welcome everyone here tonight. There's so many of you, and I see from the chat line that you're coming from all over the country, and that's really thrilling for us. As Jennifer said, this is a fantastic house, and we've been closed for a long time, and that's never happened to us in our over 50-year history at this point. This house is an amazing place, and I do encourage you to come see it. It is the place from which Mark Twain wrote all of his best-known books, including Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, Prince and the Pauper, and a number of others as well. It's really from here that Mark Twain told the rest of the world what it was about to be an American and taught Americans about themselves, too. And so we're always thrilled to have visitors here, and we have visitors from all over the country and all over the world when we're open, and that is going to happen in the beginning of April, so we're thrilled about that. The other thing that I'm here for tonight is to say how thrilled I am to be having the premiere event of a partnership with Harper's Magazine. This means a lot to us, not just because Harper's is Harper's, but because Harper's and Twain were a thing 150 years ago. Harper's was founded in 1850 when Twain was only 15 years old, but he had an association with Harper's Magazine for a long time. So this seems like a natural fit for us, and we are thrilled to be doing author talks with Harper's Magazine. So with that, I won't bore you with myself any longer because I know you're here to see Lauren and to hear Chris talk to Lauren, and that's going to be a great program. So enjoy, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for being here. And speaking of that wonderful relationship between Harper's and Mark Twain and the Mark Twain House, I want to alert you to another thing that's in the chat, and we'll repost it a few times, but Harper's has made a very generous offer to people who participate in these joint programs of ours. You can subscribe to Harper's a year, both the digital and print editions, for $21.97. And as a subscriber myself, I will tell you that's a really good bargain. And you also get access to their 170-year archive, which includes some of the stories that Mark Twain wrote that Peter just mentioned. So thank you so much, Harper's, for making that offer available to us. And I encourage many of you to take advantage of it. So I would like to start by introducing Christopher Bea. No, it's Bea. We just went over this. Christopher Bea is the editor of Harper's Magazine. His most recent novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, was nominated for the 2020 National Book Award, and he's going to be here later in the season to talk with us about that. So I'd like to welcome Christopher, and Christopher is going to introduce Lauren to us. So, excuse me. Hi, Christopher. Thank you for being here with us.
Hi, thanks for having me. I want to echo your sentiments about how thrilled we are at Harper's to be starting this relationship. And I'm glad to be here talking with Lauren.
And then bring Lauren up now too, and you can introduce her
and here
for
is
us.
Lauren. So Lauren's going to read a little bit from her novel, Fake Accounts. I will just say briefly, by way of introduction, that Fake Accounts is Lauren's debut novel, but she, before writing it, had already developed a major reputation as a literary and cultural critic, which I think we'll be discussing a little bit. And Fake Accounts is, it has gotten an enormous and well-deserved response, and she's been doing a lot of events, and I understand that this is among the last ones, so you are very lucky to be able to see her tonight, because this may be everyone's last chance for a while. Thanks for being here with me, Lauren.
Thank you for having me, and I saved the best for last, so great. Thanks.
So
thanks to the Mark.
Do you want to get right into the reading? Do you want to say a little bit about the book?
Yeah, sure. I'm terrible at summarizing the book, like even worse than if I just read from the back. But basically, I'm going to read from the very beginning, so you don't need that much synopsis. It's about a woman who decides to go through her boyfriend's phone right after Donald Trump is elected and right before he's inaugurated as president. And she makes a startling discovery. He's not cheating on her, as she suspects, but in fact is operating a very popular anonymous conspiracy theory meme account on Instagram. And this leads her to decide to break up with him in the perfect way. But before she can do that, something happens. So I'm just going to read from the first couple of paragraphs. Consensus was the world was ending, or would begin to end soon, if not by exponential environmental catastrophe, then by some combination of nuclear war, the American two-party system, patriarchy, white supremacy, gentrification, globalization, data breaches, and social media. People looked sad on the subway, in the bars. Decisions were questioned, opinions rearranged. The same brave epiphany was dragged around everywhere. We were transitioning from an only retrospectively easy past to an inarguably more difficult future. We were, it could no longer be denied, unstoppably bad. Although the death of any hope for humanity was surely decades in the making, the result of many intersecting systems described forbiddingly well, it was only that short period between the election of a new president and his holding up a hand to swear to serve the people's interests that made clear what had happened, that we were too late. I didn't believe all of this necessarily, though as the news got worse and more bizarre, I wavered. I've always been drawn to pragmatism, just not exactly a natural at it. As my brain says, calm down, my heart says, also weirdly calmly, a paradoxical comfort can be found in drama. It was and still is my official position, if you were to ask me at a party or something, that the popular turn to fatalism could be attributed to self-aggrandizement and an ignorance of history, history being characterized by the population's quickness to declare apocalypse finally imminent, despite its permanently delayed arrival. We don't want to die, but we also don't want to do anything challenging, such as what living requires. So the volubility with which certain doom was discussed made a tedious kind of sense. The end of the world would let us have our cake and eat it too. We would have no choice but to die, our potential conveniently unrealizable due to our collapse. Until such time, the idea that everything was totally pointless now was seductive, particularly as a mantra you could take advantage of when it suited you and abandon when life actually started to feel alarming. I myself was soon using it to indulge some of my naughtier impulses, by which I mean that in the first hours of a morning in early January, while the sky was still dark and the government still inevitably hurtling, I decided to snoop through my boyfriend's phone while he was asleep. I'd never really had the urge to go through another person's things before. After a few disappointing experiences with high school boyfriends' instant message histories, I'd learned that poking around the byproducts of other people's thoughts usually yielded the mundane, the predictable, and the unattractive. Even with men I respected intellectually, I never found myself caring enough to breach their trust. Before Felix, my boyfriends exuded the wholesome, loving, deep-down reliability of hot dads on television shows, despite being, as far as I knew, not hot, nor dads, nor on television. Another way of putting this is that before Felix, I had good taste. But over the year and a half we'd been together, Felix had revealed himself to be completely unrevealing, insisting over and over as I baited and nagged and implored him to tell me his innermost hopes, fears, and childhood-formed biases, either that there was nothing to tell, or, conflictingly, that he'd already told me everything and it wasn't his fault if I didn't remember. It was humiliating and typical, and per the usual narrative, I assumed he was hiding something, probably other women. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So that gives a good sense, I think, of the voice of the novel throughout, which is obviously a major part of what you're doing. I want to jump to the section immediately after. I mean, this book does a lot of really interesting stuff structurally, I think, but right after the section you read from, where she goes into Felix's phone and she makes this discovery, we then have a section break and we jump back in time in a section that's labeled backstory. And the narrator says, the story of how we met is a funny one, enough that it may help answer one of the questions you probably have so far. Why was I with him? Keep in mind that right now, at the outset of this paragraph, I don't completely know the answer. That this writing is as much an effort to better understand myself, the person I can't help but feel is the most important figure in this narrative, if not, apologies, the most intriguing, as it is an effort to enchant an audience, promote certain principles I feel are lacking in contemporary literature, interpret events both world historical and interpersonal, perhaps at the same time, etc. So I thought I'd start by asking you what it is you think a novel ought to be doing as it relates to some of these kinds of things, to what extent you were setting out to do any of these things yourself, versus putting the idea that a narrative ought to be doing these things into your narrator's mouth.
Yeah, I think so. The first part where she says basically like, I'm trying to understand myself with this, that is, I think, a little bit ironic. and part of the second part of the sentence where she says like there are some principles lacking in contemporary literature that I want to correct. I think one of those principles is this like a lot of people are apparently writing their novels as kind of like therapy sessions, or as if self-expression is the only or the biggest kind of thing you need to worry about when you're publishing a book. And I strongly disagree with that. I think that it's borderline unethical, though I have not come up with a very eloquent articulation of why I think it's unethical. But I strongly feel that if people are reading my book, which probably will take you 8 to 10 hours, it needs to be giving you something besides like I'm plumbing the depths of my soul and like doing a kind of therapy thing. And there are some ideas about therapy throughout the book as well, or about psychologizing, or about sort of like easy confessions, I think, that the book resists. But also, I think on a very basic level, when I started the book and when I was sort of writing a lot of literary criticism and the sort of things I was being asked to write about, which were mostly my peers, there was like a real resistance to this kind of maximalist, long sentence, long paragraph, but also liveliness in the text that I really missed. And I really wanted to read a book that dealt with contemporary, like really contemporary issues, but in this kind of style that I like, which is very complicated. And then you can put a lot of stuff in a single sentence. And, you know, it's a little bit more interesting to me than the kind of minimalism that has been popular for the last few years.
I should say one of the nice things about being a novelist versus being a critic is that you're allowed to feel things very passionately without actually being able to justify or articulate them.
I know, but I think maybe that's what I don't realize when I'm doing criticism. Is like, why is this person feeling something so strongly and they're not justifying it in their text?
No, I'm quite interested in the way, and I wonder to what extent. I mean, to have a debut novel get as much critical attention as yours has gotten is rare, and I'm sure that, and sustained, lengthy stuff, not just sort of, 200, 300 word reviews. I'm sure that feels great, but I'm sure that you as a critic sometimes are, the readings themselves you might not entirely agree with. And right off the bat, there seemed to be this desire. Now, with a debut novel, you take the context you've got, but to put the book into the context of your earlier work as a critic. And among other things, everyone decided that you were a famously mean, tough critic, which is just bizarre to me, because I should say Lauren has written several very good pieces for Harper's, and in our case they have been appreciations of great writers like Shirley Hazard, and you don't pull punches when you don't like something. But before this became the narrative with your novel, I wouldn't have, it's not what I would have thought about you as a critic, is like, God, she's so tough, It's just, but I think that says something more about where the critical culture is, that someone who's just willing to say they don't like something then becomes like, has that reputation. But anyway, that none of that is a question. But I guess my question would be like, what do you take? How do you take this effort to read the novel as your narrator puts it, an effort to promote certain principles I feel are lacking, that people have read it as a continuation of your critical project in some ways?
Yeah, well, I think it's natural. And also as a critic, like I often read the pieces that a novelist or an essayist has written that aren't in their book or whatever, and pull things from them to try and like give a sense of what they're trying to do with their book. Right. And I definitely understood that, but I'm also, I think, someone who's written quite a lot. So the pieces that people mostly know me for are those like negative pieces about kind of famous poppy female writers. But I've written a lot of pieces, and I would probably not say, with maybe the exception of the Johnny Awful piece that I wrote, which was not really that, it wasn't the most negative thing that's ever been written. there's not, I'm like, this is not my essence. Like, this is this is not my view, my manifesto on what literature should be, right? Particularly if I've been writing it, if I'm writing a review of an essay collection, I really don't think it's the same as a novel. So yeah, I mean, I think I also expected that to happen. So I was very like mentally prepared, and as it happened, like, people mentioned it over and over again, it started to become sort of meaningless to me, which is very useful. And I feel like quite lucky, because then you can kind of like equalize your your feelings about your public persona, or whatever your feelings about. And if you are exposed, it was basically exposure therapy to like the idea of being criticized. And now I'm like, well, I just have to go forth with whatever I think. But I think the harder thing to take was the idea that the book is just criticism of culture, and that is somehow rare or strange for a novel to be, because I think that the novel has like long been a form that allows for a more sort of expansive view of culture and of critique than maybe an essay in a magazine that you're writing on deadline, but also has all these other parameters that you have to deal with.
Has it long been your aspiration to write fiction, and the nonfiction is sort of what happened along the way, or?
Yeah, I mean, I started writing nonfiction. It's not that I didn't want to write nonfiction, but I really wanted to write fiction, and I found it much more sort of exciting when I started doing it when I was like at the end of college. And particularly book criticism. This is going to sound ridiculous because I went to Yale, so but I really didn't like know about the LRB. I don't think I knew about the NYRB. I think I knew about the New Yorker and like Harper's as a publisher of reportage, because they really teach you to like want to do that kind of long form reporting there. But I started doing criticism because my friend in Berlin, I was living in Berlin, and my friend was asked to do a top 10 list about like zines, and she couldn't do it because she was going on vacation. She was like, do you want to do this? And so I like looked up all these zines, and we made a top 10 list of the coolest zines that were coming out right now. And they were like, do you want to write a top 10 list of the top 10 best characters in pension? And I was like, sure. And then they gave me a column that I did for like 2 years of literary top 10 lists. So that's really how I got into it. And that's also like, in order to come up with ideas for this column, which I had to do every week, and I was paid 25 British pounds for, I had to be really sort of reading a lot of periodicals and like looking for things that were coming out and finding all sorts of weird stuff. And that's why I started reading a lot of contemporary fiction and contemporary novels. So that's.
And were you writing fiction all along the way, or are there desk drawer novels? There's
a lot of stories, but there's no novel, because I think I was waiting for a good idea. And so I would always write short stories, and I was like I was doing, fiction exchanges with people in Berlin and things like that. And then there was always this sort of like, should you apply for an MFA? It's free money kind of thing, like lurking around in the background, that I never really did, because I enjoyed like being in it in the way that I was when I was doing literary blogging, basically, and then working at Vice too. So I wouldn't say that was enjoyable, but it was good. It was good to do, I think.
So I want to talk a little bit about, because you mentioned the Jenny Offal, and you have a riff where you have a section of the book that is done in the form of for those who are watching who don't know Jenny Offal's books, a novel that came out a few years ago called Department of Speculation was very, very widely hailed, and then the more recent one is called Weather, and they're done in this model that I think it was David Markson who perfected this thing. I mean, those books are amazing, but they're all very short paragraphs, and the paragraphs are separated out by white space line breaks in between them. And there's a mixture of, there's never any scenes. Everything is like you're with the character for a couple of lines, and then you jump out and you've got some random piece of kind of literary trivia or information about climate change or, social criticism or whatever, or some like quote from Confucius, and then you jump to some scene 2 weeks later, and then the whole thing, that's the novel for 250 pages. And I'm being that makes it sound a little dismissive, but I think you are to some extent a little dismissive of it, or you maybe.
I'm not categorically dismissive of it. Also, to be clear, I had not read Jenny Awful when I wrote that part of my novel, so it was not a parody of Jenny Awful. It was so popular even 4 years ago when I wrote it that I thought to parody it then, and it continues to be so popular. But everybody thinks that it's about Jenny Awful because I reviewed her second book recently. But that's when I read all of Jenny Awful. Was
okay. So the book has a section.
Not that it matters at all, but the lore is interesting.
It's a fair point to make. And there are a lot of people who work in this form, and there has been, as you mentioned in the book itself, this kind of discourse around the form that suggests that it's a particularly feminine form, and that there's something even feminist about like respecting this form as a great artistic form and not being dismissive of how insubstantial it can feel and stuff like that. So you sort of work through all of that, and then the narrator gives it a shot to write in that way for a while, in a way that's very funny. I wonder to what extent you were actively, also the way that you play with autofiction as a form, trying to play with different genres within the contemporary literary novel.
Yeah, and I think too, within the context of the novel itself, it comes at a very useful point because the character is sort of unmoored and she's like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm looking for structure in my life. And so she hears this person talking about the fragments and how they were quite useful to her. So she's like, maybe I'll try to do the fragments. She finds that the fragments are not a good structure for working. They do not help her organize her life. But the book is like full of these sort of like arbitrary decisions kind of that are seeking to provide structure. She moves to Berlin for sort of kind of no reason. She starts going on OkCupid dates, and instead of sort of doing it earnestly, she makes up a different personality each time she goes on them, and she uses the signs of the zodiac as models for her personality. And that's, I think, how astrology works as well. Or you're sort of like, well, what do? I might as well do this because it's a pre-existing structure for my life. And I think, at least with the fragments, like it seems like a lot of people just turn to it because it's there, and it's quite seductive as a form because it's very fun. I mean, I had a great time when I was doing that, and I found it very easy to do. And so I can see why you would turn to it, even if it's probably not the best thing for most books. Certainly there are some books that I think it works. I'm not saying. I also think that the fragmented section of N.W. Zadie Smith's novel from like 2012 is really good, just as like one example. But even the older like Elizabeth Hardwick, Renata Adler type of stuff I think is quite good, though I would say maybe actually they could have been less fragmented in some cases. Not to if they called me, I would have helped.
Those books are like sacrosanct now.
I know if they called me and help them.
Yeah. But it does seem also, it's like it is easier to do. It's harder to sustain a scene, to sustain momentum and stuff. But it's also I wonder, because obviously this book is a lot about people who spend a lot of their time online and on social media in particular, and what that does to them and what that does to their offline lives. It also does seem like that fragmented stuff requires less sustained attention from readers, and in that way is sort of more inviting for someone who has had their brain completely fried by the internet.
Well, yeah, and it's also just it's fun. You can read a whole book really fast and you're like, oh wow, this is not even difficult. But I don't find it rewarding that often either. But I also think that this is sort of in the book as well, like the idea that the internet has made our experience of time fragmented is something that I kind of disagree with, but I don't know how best to. I feel like an oppressive continuity when you look up and you're like, I've just spent 2 hours on the internet doing nothing or whatever. It's not that. it's not that I feel fragmented necessarily. It's not that I feel that time has been chopped up. It's that I feel that time has been compressed or expanded or something like that. But having.
But do you find yourself? This is just like a personal conversation at this point. But like, do you find yourself like, you know, if you sit down to read, like I'm reading The Magic Mountain right now for a piece that I happen to be writing, you know, and I turn the page and I just get like a block of text with no paragraph breaks, and I look at it, and I mean, it's one of my favorite novels ever, you know, I love it.
Yeah.
But it's been a few years since I read it, and I turn the page and I see this block of text, and I find myself going like, I wonder if I've gotten any emails in the last 5 minutes, you know, and like picking my phone up, and I just like, that feels to me like something that the internet has done to our brains.
I've never been an adult during a time when that wasn't the case. So you would be a better person to say if something has changed.
An old person like me.
No, right? Not old. I mean, you have experienced the last good part of life, so I don't feel bad for you at all.
That's true. That's true.
Like, I never got anything. I don't know. I mean, yes, it does feel bad, but I feel like that's I feel somehow that that's a personal failing and not the internet's fault, right? Like, I don't think that the internet has done that. It's like I've allowed myself to become addicted to the internet,
right?
Which,
but are you?
It is how it
as
feels.
A writer. Yeah, I mean, this goes back. David Foster Wallace used to talk about how television had done this to people too. There's never a time where most people like sat and read The Magic Mountain.
Yeah.
So, but there was this going back into the 80s and early 90s. There's a sense that because of television, novelists really needed to be more entertaining, basically. Right. And I wonder, you know, it's just like it had to be fun. You had to, you know, people had other options. And is that sort of like issue of attention something you're conscious of while you're writing?
Well, I wanted my book to be fun, but I wanted it to be serious. But I wanted it to be really fun to read, even as it was doing all these other things. So I guess I wanted to have it all. I don't know. But I also think that there's this sort of overcorrection with a lot of things that I read, where people think that being boring on its own is an artistic merit, right? And I think that entertainment or boredom ought to be a sort of subsidiary, like a secondary quality of the work, and the first quality should be whatever else we're looking at, right? And I think, I'm sure someone could do something really good if they're like, I wanted to write the most boring novel ever. But it would have to be the right person. It would have to be the right novel, right?
Right.
And I don't think, like, you know, I don't think, is The Magic Mountain boring? No, it's just,
no,
it's not flat. It's not psychological. I mean, it's right. Psychological, but it's not psychologically manipulating you like a Taylor Swift song is, which you're like, this is very catchy. It's catchy. It's designed to make you feel like it's catchy, right? It's designed to make you feel something and to like provoke that response. I can't remember.
I think what it is
there's
great novels. Often they ask the reader to give a little something to get a little something, as opposed to the things in our culture that are kind of not demanding anything at all.
Right. Yeah. And what I think is unethical about being a bad novelist is asking the reader to give something and not giving them anything in return. Right. And also, you know, to a certain extent, these things are subjective. Like, someone who might find something wildly fascinating that I find super boring, and vice versa. But were you trying to be entertaining when you wrote your novel, or to keep the reader's attention?
Yeah, I wanted it to feel engrossing. I would definitely wanted it to, I try to be funny once in a while. I would like it to be moving. You know, I want it to, you know, but I to the extent that I have a reader in mind. It's like I'm writing for people who love big novels. You know, the one thing, what I don't, you know, there's some people who talk about you've got to meet the readers where they are, or you're gonna, you know, there's this anxiety about the literary novel being closed off from certain people, and I just feel like it's always had a limited audience as a genre, and I'd much rather write for the people like who love that thing than try and write a debased form of it in order to bring more people into the
Well, also there are plenty of debased forms of it those are not in short supply. The range of, like, for lack of a better term, lowbrow to middlebrow novels is extreme. You know, there's a lot in there.
Right.
I don't need to do that. But then, you know, then people started telling me when I first sent the galleys out to be read, and people started being like, I couldn't put this down about my book. I was like, oh no, that means something bad. What have I done? I didn't mean for it to be fun. I mean for it to be like riveting. So I don't know. This whole conversation creates all of these like anxieties that I'm like, of course you should want to read it. It's terrible to be bored with a novel and feel like you're wasting your time. You're not getting anything out of it. So yeah.
But I do think one of the sort of challenges you set for yourself, or one of the things, I think this book, like all great books, can sort of be read on several different levels. It feels to me, and maybe you will disagree, or maybe you haven't really read the criticism, and if so, like, God bless you. But it feels like a lot of it is responding on a superficial level, because there's a very easy way to plug it into the discourse, you know, which is like, Lauren Oyler, the critic who was nasty to Gia Tolentino and Roxane Gay, has written this novel about the internet, and you know, and I don't know. You're doing so much, I think, intellectually interesting stuff. So much for people who really love the novel as a form. There's so much going on in terms of what happens structurally. The way that you play with this inciting incident at the beginning, and then just kind of like disappear it for hundreds of pages, and you know, when she arrives in Berlin, it does essentially just turn into a basic what reads like a work of autofiction for that period of time, you know, but then all sorts of other weird stuff happens, and I don't know, it's in a way a book that does the other stuff less well, in terms of just being readable and all stuff. I think maybe the really exciting, great things it's doing would get noted more, but you've made it a little too easy to talk about in this other way.
I mean, I think too, like, because I worked as a journalist, I understand why everybody's like doing that. They need a headline, but at the same time, like, the same piece has been written over and over again, so you don't want to do that headline anymore. I don't know. But I was talking to my friend about it, and he was like, no one has mentioned the relationship anarchist hardly at all. And I was like, the whole book is really about dating. And this is another, you know, I was thinking about like the bad boyfriend novel, but like making fun of the bad boyfriend novel.
Right.
And I was thinking about how funny it would be to have like, oh, there's an apocalypse at the beginning, but the apocalypse is going to be this woman is going to dump her boyfriend that she doesn't even like anyway. And then, you know, like, no, I wondered if, like, because within the sort of cultural critic milieu, like, feminism has become so mainstream that you can't say, I've written a book about dating. It's like a very serious novel, I hope, about, like, I wanted it to be like a very serious novel, like a women's piece of women's fiction. And also this autofiction stuff, like, it's definitely, people would be like asking me questions like, I'm really sorry to ask you about autofiction. I'm like, the novel is about autofiction.
Right.
You know, you can ask me about it because I'm using myself like to mess as a device, basically. Which,
right, you give the narrator your Twitter profile picture.
yes.
Yeah. There's definitely, like, I don't know, there's a lot of talk about Roth right now because this Blake Bailey biography is coming out, and I think, like, that's something that he did really well, that, like, with the new era of autofiction is getting kind of erased a little bit, but he would play with that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He'd use himself and then create this distance between himself and the character, and then he'd, you know, in the next novel he'd play with that distance that he's, you know, and I just think there's much more of interest to be done with using your own life material for a novel than simply writing autobiographical fiction.
Yeah, and particularly I think now, I don't like to say social media is so unique, but I think what is unique about it in the context of fiction is that it creates this tons and tons of fake autobiographical material that people can just find about you if they want to go looking for it. And I accidentally, because I didn't know when I was 16 and I was like on Facebook or whatever, have like lots of this material online, and that can be overwhelming and it feels very bad at times, but also you can then like manipulate it in this way and create this instability or this uncertainty about it that is, I think, very interesting, and also sort of it's a similar thing to what Roth does a lot of the time. It's similar,
Right.
It's similar to autofiction, and like the whole idea of autofiction is that it's sort of like anticipating your deep down feeling like some of this has to do with the author, right? And that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, it used to be in like the Roth and Mailer era, you had to write something more conventional to become famous, and then you could play with your persona,
Mm-hmm.
But Roth couldn't have created Zuckerman without writing Portnoy's first. He
Right.
had to be the most famous literary novelist in America before he could write a novel about being the most famous literary novelist in America.
Yeah.
And now we do have all this wealth of information online where everybody has a persona, and then you can be playing with that in your very first book.
Right. And I also think too, there's this like I think for a long time, everyone has thought like, oh, well, I don't know if that's true. People say a lot of things on Twitter, right? They say all sorts of things on Twitter, and all of them have varying degrees of truth, right? They're all some percentage of true or false, and you don't know who's being truthful or not. And so sometimes I will be talking to my friends about something that has happened on Twitter, and I will be like, well, of course they're lying. And the person will say, what? Why would they lie? And it's like, because they can, or because it gets them like 20 hearts on Twitter, or, whatever. I think that there's tons of lying going on all the time. And if you I saw someone like posted, people just post all sorts of things. Like someone posted a drawing that her child had done that the child clearly had not done. Like there was just no way that the child had done this drawing. And she was like, oh yeah, my kid drew this. And it makes you crazy because it's so banal. It doesn't matter that they're lying. And that is what's really interesting about it. Like it's not state secrets. It's just, blah, 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 pay attention to me for 2 seconds stuff. And I think this, like, the feeling that nothing matters online can be very alienating as well.
So I feel like we could continue talking for a while, but we do want to open this up to questions now. Yeah.
Crowdcast was being recalcitrant. Thank you.
Okay.
You guys, we'd love to hear you keep talking forever and ever. This has been one of the most literarily interesting and writerly conversations we've had the pleasure of hosting. So I really appreciate, personally, and I think our audience as well, are really getting into the nitty-gritty of these issues. And this is kind of probably an obvious question, but I wonder, would you have written this novel differently, Lauren, had you written it post-COVID or during COVID? What would have been different about that?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that the sort of social media paranoia, the things that I feel sad about are after I finish the book, and it takes place, I try to make it very sort of specific to the micro historical period because everything is going to be dated so fast anyway. But people started getting like really nuts on Twitter and doing really crazy things online, just totally in public with their own names attached in this really way that I found very fascinating. And I was worried that my book would not seem crazy enough or not seem realistic because it might seem it doesn't go far enough. But I don't think that people had that problem. But but the paranoia, I think, of like the online space has become very heightened, and people are now like really sort of like backbiting and like gossiping in this kind of desperate way that I think is very interesting, that I would have liked to incorporate. But the only other thing is that the character moves to Berlin kind of semi-randomly, and she doesn't necessarily plan it, but then you can sort of get this an artist visa when you move there, and like just kind of show up and stay in the line forever, and then get it if you have the right few things. And if that's going to keep happening, I don't know if that's going to keep going, which is very sad. But I guess again, it is indicative of this kind of like post-decadent period of American decline, right? Like that we could just show up, though I guess for most of the 20th century you could just show up as American and everybody would be like, give us your dollars. So it's actually it's weird that you have to, it was a relatively short period that you had to apply for a visa to stay in Europe for this period of time anyway, I guess. But
it's a funny thing about this need to be hyper specific, because like a century ago, like, you know, Henry James would have novels and it would start like, in the last decades of the previous century there lived a girl who, you know, there was just this sense that you could write something that was like you could work on a book for 10 years that was set in the present,
right?
And that was and now people, it's like you need to know what 6-month period a book is occurring in if you want it to have any of the kind of weight of social reality in it.
Right. And I don't know, I mean, so you do think that that's true? Because I used to get really like not mad, but I would get mad about books that were more or less about my generation, that were set like more or less in the present, that didn't involve social media or the internet in a sort of realistic way, right? Like there is a sense like we need to keep this as far away as possible, even though it's the way that we all talk and communicate all day, every day. And it does sort of create these like different social networks that affect the kind of relationships details that go into a novel.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's obviously possible to write, you know, all sorts of like non-social realist novels that have very little of the texture of like the world of their given time period in them, you know. I mean, you can still write like a sort of Beckett type novel or something like that, but it's just it feels like one of the changes that has happened, it's not just that time moves so much more quickly in its way, but also everyone is engaged with what's going on in the world, you know. Like you don't always know when you're reading a Henry James novel who was president during the period when it's set, you know, but it's just like the idea, and not even before Trump, the idea that two real human beings would go through an entire day in America and whoever was president would not come up once, even that is just like, it's just not realistic.
I know. And also I think too, this like I don't know. I mean, like I said, I've never been alive any other time, so I don't really know. But like this like awareness that everybody has, everybody's imbibing the news all day. So the idea that you wouldn't be aware of things makes you like kind of, you would be unusual. And knowing all of that stuff like means that you have to have, I think at least, layers of self-referentiality in your text, because otherwise it doesn't seem realistic. Like there have been a lot of comments about the self-awareness of my narrator, but I think like, I mean, first I thought self-awareness was like a good thing. I thought that was good. But there's been all this stuff about the millennial novel in general, about how the narrators are always very self-aware and how it's like annoying because you get in a trap or whatever, but that's what everyone is like. And if you lack self-awareness, that's, you know, speaks to some quality about you rather than having self-awareness or like understanding the various confining situations that you might find yourself in.
And I mean, people said the same thing about like the kind of Homo Gen X novel that was like hyper ironic and hyper self-aware and self-referential. And I think it's been going on for a while now. It takes a kind of willful distancing to have a narrator who isn't already aware of all of the mediating narrators, you know?
Yeah. And yeah, I think it's strange. It's also, I don't know. What do you think about the idea that I sometimes have, which is that people want a novelist to be kind of stupid?
Yeah, I think there is like there's I it's very interesting to me that we American literary culture has embraced this whole series of foreign writers. First it was Sebald, then it was Bologna, then it was Welbeck and Ferrante and Knausgaard, who have something like a little bit dark about them, something that is really writing against the moment, and something that is that kind of, and with Knausgaard there's a kind of stupidity to it, and but American writers can't get away with doing that, and it's like if Jonathan Franzen says he doesn't like Twitter, then all of a sudden like he needs to get like crucified. But if he like, because he's from like St. Louis, but if he'd said that with a German accent, people would love it. He would be, that's what an artist is not supposed to like Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I also think like people want this, like, they want you to be an artist. They want the inspiration to flow through you. They don't want you to have to think about it, or they want the thinking to be like totally invisible.
Right.
Even if thinking is increasingly the contemporary novelist's subject, and I mean it has been for a long time, but yeah, I think
there's this great trope of like that was big with Knausgaard, but that novelists eventually find the vein, and whatever it is, their childhood or this trauma or whatever, and then they plug into it, and then it all just flows out. And what we want to read is the flowing. And there was always the work that went before the flowing, but we want to feel like the pages we're reading, there's no work there. There's no thought there. It's all just sort of like a divining rod or something.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, like the disconnect between that, but also I can't tell if people really want an autobiographical story or not, right? Like, do they want you to be present, or do they want you to just be the sort of conduit for your psychology and your story and your whatever your feelings? I can't really tell, because the idea sometimes that a novelist has taken things from their life, sometimes it's very marketable, and then sometimes it's like horrifying and cheating.
Like it's cheating, yeah.
Yeah, like you didn't make it up enough. But maybe the answer to all of this is just that people have conflicting views that they don't really think that much about.
Yeah. Or you can't win.
You can't win. Yeah.
Now, you each have tossed out a lot of literary names. Could I pin you down and ask you each to tell us who your, if you have them, literary idols are, or who has, that alarmed you, Lauren, I'm sorry. But people you have admired either since childhood or more recently. I think we'd love to hear about that.
Do you want to go first?
I can.
You can go first.
I think people are here to hear you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think when I was writing this book, I was thinking this is a name that nobody says, Margaret Drabble, but I really love her novels, and I love them. Like, I love a lot of people from this generation. I like Doris Lessing too, but not as much as Margaret Drabble. I just love Margaret Drabble, and I think it was this, like, she and a few other women in the sort of 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like there was like a real feeling of freedom, and like they had finally been, like, life had opened up for them in a way that now it feels like it's closed again in some way, particularly for a woman. I think you're pressured to think of yourself as being kind of unfree, even though, of course, you're freer than you've ever been. But I like her. I like Muriel Spark. I like Doris Lessing. And then also, I always say I love Helen DeWitt, but when I read The Last Samurai, I was like, this is perfect. This is a genius novel. I love this novel. And I think you can see the influence in my book as well. Hopefully not too much, but some.
I will just say about Helen DeWitt, I read that book in Galley because I was an intern when I was in college at Talk Miramax Books.
Oh, wow.
There was, Tina Brown was there every day.
Mm-hmm.
Harvey Weinstein made the occasional appearance.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the books we were publishing that summer was called Confessions of a Gossip. I don't know. It was like the Daily News gossip columnist, like memoir.
Okay.
And then another one, they were like, we're really excited about this novel too. It's called The Last Samurai by Helen DeWitt. And they paid a bunch of money for it. And I just assumed it was terrible.
Right.
And then they gave it to me, and I had no anything. It wasn't even a galley. It was just manuscript pages. And I read it, and my jaw. I mean, I think we would both agree it's one of the great of the last 20 years or so. One of the great novels.
Yeah, like I want to reread it all the time, and that is not something I feel. I feel like I will get something out of rereading it like a lot, and I just reread it. I don't know. 2-3 years ago or something, but yeah.
Have you read Mavis Gallant at all?
Yes, but I don't take to her as much as I take to the others. Does that make sense?
It does. I love her.
I haven't read that
her,
much.
But
what do you like about her? She's very restrained.
She is very restrained. She's very funny, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And she does really interesting formal stuff. I think James Wood said about Roth that he would be called an experimentalist, except all his experiments come off. And I think there's that element. People don't think of her as a formally inventive writer, but every story it's like she's figuring out all over again how to structure a story and how to tell a story. But they don't read. She's not Donald Barthelme.
Right.
They don't read like experimentalist stuff. But so you can just like go back to a lot of those stories over and over again.
What are the best ones?
The Muslim Wife is the one that like I really adore. Varieties of Exile. There's one that I'm not going to get the title quite right, but I think it's The Ice Wagon Coming Down the Street.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, she's like of the writers of that period who you're talking about, my favorite, but also someone who is like was sort of personally heroic in that she grew up in rural Canada. She went to Paris, I think, as a journalist, and when she was in her early 20s, she just started like sending stories to William Maxwell, and just lived alone in Paris for 70 years writing short stories.
And her agent took her money, right? That's her.
Yes, and then that happened.
Famously. I mean, I love it. Yeah. I also just I like Europe. It's embarrassing. It's not cool, but I just like Europe. I like things that are set in Europe. I like the 20th century. I like people who are in different countries of Europe from the countries that they were born in. Like, great. My favorite thing.
Well, my colleague Jacques Lamar in the chat has said actually the correct answer to my question was Mark Twain. So remember that, please, for next time. No, I was really surprised by your answer, though. I mean, that's a lot of those are names that you don't often hear in response to the question that I posed. So thank you for being off the beaten path there. Thanks. So we have a couple more audience questions. Are you game for a couple things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. So Donald wants to have Lauren talk about the satirical short paragraph tarot section.
Oh yeah. So you could be talking about the astrology thing, or there's one paragraph that's like, no, she talks about in the past she's had a friend read her astrological birth chart. I don't know if there's tarot in the book. Tarot is basically the same. No offense to the spiritualists in the audience. Basically, I think astrology was very popular on social media when I was writing this book. It seems like it's a little bit less popular now, but people are still, I mean, it's always been popular. But it seemed like people were really starting to believe it in this really aggressive way. And it became very sort of like boutique astrology, where you would know your rising sign and your moon sign and my Venus is in whatever and blah, blah, blah. You would know all these things about your astrological chart, which can be very complicated and actually like involves math. And I worked at this women's website, Broadly, which was at Vice. And we had these horoscopes that we published every day, and it was like the most popular thing on the website. It got tons of traffic and everybody loved them. And so I learned a lot about astrology in that way, but it's still like fake, right? Like it's not literally real. But then it started to seem like some of the people that I would encounter would be like, yeah, well, the moon moves the tides. Why wouldn't the planets control our feelings or whatever? And you would be like, uh-huh. And you would say something and they would be like, well, that's because you're a Leo. And you would be like, but this is a serious problem. Like, I'm not joking. Like, okay, it's funny. Like, stop. Let's talk about it seriously. And I think that there is like an interpretive thing about it. If you're using it the correct way, then it's supposed to be like an art of interpretation, which the book is concerned with a lot. But if it becomes a sort of dictating element in your life, I think it becomes kind of a problem. And so she goes on a bunch of OkCupid dates and she models her fake personality each time off of one of the astrological signs. So I had to read about what the typical traits of the signs were, and it was there's a line that's like, it's quite boring to learn about the made up characteristics of like people you don't know. And it just,
which is what reading a novel is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But it's kind of ridiculous. But I also think something the narrator, I think, kind of hopes that someone is going to call her out for being weird. And everybody's just like, you just meet a lot of weird people on OkCupid, I guess. And it just moves on and doesn't really care that she's being super bizarre. I hope that answers your question. It was kind of an open-ended question.
Well, Donald does say that he meant astrology. So
yeah, I was like, there could be tarot in there.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm just going to say it phonetically. Dag Ann asked a question twice, and this is a biggie, so let's see. Okay. As someone who is passionate about the ethical ramifications of lazy writing, but who also seems pretty critical of the way social media can irrationally moralize various situations, what is your stance on being a moralizer?
Oh, I mean, I think that there are I think a big problem with social media and the sort of political climate that I operate in is total disproportion. So there's like, at some point, you're operating under political fiction that at some point was true, and then people take the fact that a part of this is true in some way and then use it to blow up their argument and to make a sort of hyperbolic argument. And I think traditionally people say like, well, you have to be hyperbolic online, otherwise nobody would pay attention to you. But I think that you're being paid attention to for like, like the shock value or the extreme value of what you're saying, but everybody sort of understands that it's not totally true. Then it becomes, I think, a problem. And it's not, is it wrong? I don't know. It's certainly, I fully believe it's not strategic in terms of talking about politics. But then I also think that a lot of this kind of rhetoric that goes on, like the moralizing rhetoric, is not actually in service of any political aim. And it's in fact in service of like basically personal branding, or like more or less like getting attention, not even personal branding. So it's difficult to say. Also, I think you can say something is unethical and not be, I think you can be thinking about ethics or even about morals without being moralistic, right? Yeah. Would you agree, Chris?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, it feels to me like the novel has a moral project to it. Your novel.
Yeah.
Not just like the novel as a form, but yeah.
I think she's very like, I see it as she's really fantasizing about reciprocity, and the things that she does are always like in response to people or at least her perceiving people doing things. And I think her interpretation of her boyfriend Felix and his conspiracy theory stuff is like, she sees it as a response to like the false openness of the world in which they live. And so like, there are lots of scenes in which people are like telling her to be open or to go to a therapist or like to do, they're speaking in these kind of like canned phrases that she finds very upsetting. And there's one scene in particular where she's like having dinner with an old friend who has once seen her through a lot of like hard times. And the old friend is like talking to her in these like, rote. She gets upset that she's not trying to really understand her. And she wants to be given this sort of epiphany, confessional, like trauma therapy, whatever kind of thing. And the narrator doesn't want to give it to her. So I think that is like a very long-winded way of saying, I hope that does seem that it has a moral project, but it's not.
It seems to me that like one of the things a novel is supposed to do is like be moral without moralizing.
Yeah.
And one of the like huge problems with our online culture is an inability to distinguish between the two of those things.
Right. And I think too, there's an online thing where, in relation to what we were talking about earlier with like, oh, you need to make the literary novel accessible to everyone. There's this idea that if you have a platform, you need to be your platform needs to be catering to the lowest common denominator. So you need to be talking to like the dumbest possible person who could ever encounter you. And that means a lot of things, but it means one of the things it means is that the smart people have no recourse. Like they have nothing to pay attention to because everyone is like, I'm for the dumb people, even though there's plenty of
everything's
really basic stuff. Everything's for dumb
Right.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't, it's this weird, like precious thing about like influence, which I guess, there are nefarious influences at work in our political system, but they're not, the people who are affected by those are not going to be reading my Twitter feed, like
Right.
ever. Right. They're not going to be reading my novel. So it doesn't, you don't need to be worried about.
But it's also like the way that the discourse works when it comes to politics, where you're supposed to be very sort of like teleologically oriented, and you're not supposed to criticize your own team, and like that makes sense in a certain way when you're like talking about politics and the country's going to be faced with this choice between Biden and Trump. You don't need to be like nitpicking what your issues with Biden is versus like whoever, but people have now brought that into the realm of culture, and it's just like when people say stuff that is manifestly just sort of like stupid and wrong, and I do actually mean like you as Lauren as a critic just point it out and say like that's stupid and wrong, then it becomes like you're being mean.
Yeah,
that person's on our team, you're being counterproductive, you're being this and that. But it's like culture is not supposed to work that way.
No, and also like it's not, I'm not on a team, being a voter does not mean like you're on a team. And it's, I don't know, then this is the sort of idea that like creates all this like kind of infighting that you see on the various factions of the left that is very fascinating to watch on Twitter, but depressing in general. But I also kind of think, and I don't know if you think this, that so few of the people on the, like broadly speaking, the left, like this have thought about life, like what people want out of life, and they don't understand that politics is supposed to facilitate life, and they don't understand like most people don't want to dedicate their lives to a political project. And I kind of think that if they just read like a bit of philosophy, they would understand the meaning. Like,
right. Well, it's supposed to be the great advantage of like liberalism is that it allows everyone the space to work out their own issues of ultimate concern in these non-political places. And then politics is where we sort of bracket that stuff and try and get things done in this very practical way, but it's not supposed to be what your life project is.
Right. Yes, and you have written about this, I think, before.
Probably too much. Yeah.
So I imagine a lot of our audience is sharing my feeling that, oh my gosh, do these people like get to sit around and have these conversations like every day? Are you like in your Harper's offices having these discussions, or are you like,
We have some of these discussions. I don't have them with Lauren, but Lauren has, I already said, has written some great stuff for us. And she just said before we started, she mentioned that she is meeting with not one, but two Harper's editors in the next week. So we are hoping to have much more from her in our pages soon.
Well,
Thank you.
and we're hoping to have you both come to Hartford to visit the Mark Twain House. So one of the things we like to point out is that the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. And right now is not the moment maybe for you to come, but please do come see us soon. And we'll give you the grand tour. And folks, if you were not compelled to buy this book before this talk, I know you are now. So please follow the link in the chat. And take advantage of that wonderful subscription offer. And Jacques has very helpfully posted that our next of these Harper's and Mark Twain House programs is happening on April 14th. It's once again going to be Christopher talking to Christine Smallwood. And as he rightly points out, her book, The Life of the Mind, got a rave review from the New York Times Review of Books. So we're looking forward to that. And I'd say this series is off to a really great start. So thank you both for a wonderful, stimulating, fascinating evening. I can't wait to watch it over again. So thank you for being here. Thank you to our audience.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lauren.
Thank you for the great questions too. Bye.
Bye-bye. Happy reading and
Bye.
writing.
Thanks. Bye.